William Tecumseh Sherman was born February 8, 1820 in Lancaster, Ohio, to his father Charles Robert Sherman and mother Mary Hoyt Sherman. Sherman had family ties to the signing of the Declaration of Independence in his relative Roger Sherman, who was a U.S. founding father. Charles and Mary had 11 children. Many would become well known later in life. Charles Sherman was a lawyer and a major in the Ohio militia. He was commissary in the War of 1812. In 1821, a seat opened in the Ohio Supreme Court. His father wanted the position. A short time later, his father was accepted and served as a judge in the Ohio Supreme Court. In 1829, his father was away at circuit court. William was at school when he was picked up early and brought home. The family was told that their father had gotten deathly ill. He was 100 miles from the family home. His mother went off to see her husband before he died, but she did not make it in time. He got sick during a session and he was put in the care of a doctor. He was doing better, but after 6 days, his fever came back and he passed away. At the time of his death, it was believed he died from cholera, but there was no cases of cholera in the area. It was later believed that he died from typhoid fever. After his father's death, William was sent to live with a family friend, Thomas Ewing. He went to school in Lancaster. Thomas Ewing was a senator, and he eventually put William Tecumseh Sherman's name in for WestPoint. In 1834, he went to work on canals in Ohio as a rodman, and he made 50 cents a day. In 1836, when he was 16, Senator Ewing sent a letter telling Sherman to get his things together and to prepare for WestPoint. He took the stagecoach for Washington. In his memoirs, Sherman did not have much to say about his time at West Point, but he did have this to say about his time spent there. He went through his 4 years of classes and graduated June 1840. He was 6th in his class out of 43 cadets. There were 100 cadets when the class started, just 4 years prior. At the academy, I was not considered a good soldier, for at no time was I selected for any office, but remained a private throughout the whole 4 years. Then as now, neatness in dress and form, with a strict conformity to the rules, were the qualifications required for office, and I suppose I was not to excel in any of these. In studies, I always held a respectable reputation with the professors, and generally ranked among the best, especially in drawing, chemistry, mathematics, and natural philosophy. My average demerits per annum were about 150, which reduced my final class standing from number 4 to 6. In June 1840, after the final examination, the class graduated and received our diplomas. After West Point, Sherman was now a second lieutenant. He received a furlough and spent his time at home and then reported for duty, where he would be headed to Florida to join the fight against the Seminole Indians in the Second Seminole War. He was stationed at Fort Pierce, and he had much to write about how good the hunting and fishing was in his memoirs. He was sent on patrols to track down and capture the Indians and send them off to Oklahoma. He spent most of his time in boats searching for the Seminoles. They would travel 200 miles above the fort and 50 miles below the fort, searching in streams and lagoons. He captured many small groups of Seminoles and was involved in skirmishes with warriors. While he was at the fort, there was a murder. A soldier had his wife at the fort working in the mess hall. A sergeant got too close with this man's wife, and the husband shot and killed the sergeant. The soldier was sent to St. Augustine, where he was put on trial for murder. In 1841, a group of Indians arrived at the fort with a letter from Chief Wildcat. They wanted provisions, and they wanted safe passage for Chief Wildcat to talk about bringing in his people and immigrating to the reservation. Lieutenant Sherman rode out to meet Chief Wildcat. Sherman spoke with the chief and had his sergeant take their weapons. The chief stripped down naked and washed himself in the pond, put on his finest moccasins, buckskin leggings, shirts, and vest. the vest which still had a bullet hole in it with blood on it from the man that he killed. They all rode back to the fort, and the fort's major met with Wildcat. Wildcat wanted provisions and talked about gathering his people so they could immigrate to the reservation, but his people were scattered all over and totaled 150 to 60. They agreed and gave them 1 month to immigrate. They stayed that night and got drunk off whiskey and then left the next day. Some of the men returned over the next couple weeks begging for food and more drink. After a month, 20 warriors returned, but without the women and children. The Indians were captured and implored to go west. They set up a trap to capture the chief and his men. They surrounded the building in case anybody tried to escape, and succeeded in capturing all of the Seminole warriors. The chief admitted that he had secretly been moving his band south to Lake Okeechobee, and he had no intentions of moving west. Sherman, along with a large group of his fort, were sent to the lake to catch the women and children off guard and capture them, but they were warned ahead of time and escaped. Eventually, Wildcat was sent to get the rest of his band, and they came voluntarily and were all sent west to the reservation. Sherman was not a fan of moving the Seminoles out west. He believed that the land was much more valuable there than it was in Florida. He wrote, "We could have collected all the Choctaws, Creeks, Cherokee, and Chickasaw, in addition to the Seminoles. They would have thrived in the peninsula, whereas they now occupy lands that are coveted by their white neighbor on all sides, while the peninsula of Florida still remains with a population less than should make a good state." After he left Fort Pierce, he spent a time at Picalaca on the St. Johns River. The location was once an old Spanish fort in the 1700s. He spent time at St. Augustine as well. He spent the next few years throughout the South. He fished and hunted often. He ended up in Charleston, South Carolina at Fort Moultrie, and he spent almost 5 years there. When the Mexican-American War broke out, Sherman did not see any action. He was tasked with finding new recruits, and then he was transferred to the newly captured California. He played a role in the California Gold Rush. He was present when the first gold in the Sierras was found and sent to be inspected. Sherman inspected it and hammered it with a hatchet to see if it was indeed metal. It was metal, and it was pure. He was asked by his senior to write a letter to Sutter, who was asking to see if he could get a title for the land. Sherman wrote, since California was not a part of the United States yet, its laws did not apply, and a title to the land could not be promised. That was the first gold discovered in the Sierra Nevada and sparked the California Gold Rush. Sherman earned extra money as a surveyor in California. His army salary was only $70 a month, and he also sold lots to earn money. In 1850, Sherman married Ellen Boyle Ewing, the daughter of Thomas Ewing, who took him in as a child after his father's death. He was transferred to St. Louis, Missouri that same year. Sherman got involved in banking. He asked for a 6-month leave of absence so he could travel to San Francisco and manage the bank of Lucas, Turner and Company. He was asked this by Mr. Lucas himself. He agreed to go, and his leave was granted. He traveled on a steamer for Nicaragua, then for California. It had 600 passengers with 60 women and children. After transferring to a larger boat on the Pacific side, he got a ticket for a stateroom. In Sherman's memoirs, it seems that he was conned into adding 2 women's names onto his room list. The women took over his stateroom, and he was forced to go below deck. He wrote later that someone informed him that these 2 ladies were women of the town, which is a nice way of saying sex worker back in those days. That ship ran aground off the California coast. Luckily, the sea was calm, and no one lost their life. The passengers were ferried to the shore. Sherman, along with another passenger, found horses on top of a hill, and then followed a path to a shanty with 4 men inside. They told Sherman that he was near a sawmill, and the sawmill steamer would be headed for San Francisco. They followed the stream and found the boat. The captain agreed to let the 2 men on as long as they paid him. Once they reached San Francisco, the nose of the boat went under and the ship went on its side. Sherman had now been involved in a second shipwreck in just a few days. Sherman called a nearby ship to come over. They did. He got on board and finally made it to shore. He got help from the steamship company office in San Francisco, and the next day, all the passengers were saved. Sherman made it safe and sound after 2 shipwrecks on the same voyage. He began his work in banking and loaning money for 3% a month. He figured he could make money here. He returned to St. Louis to speak with Mr. Lucas. He wanted to start a new bank and $50,000 to build it. Mr. Lucas agreed. Sherman went to Ohio to see his wife and Mr. Ewing and explained what he was about to do. He then sent his letter of resignation to the Adjutant General of the Army. His resignation was accepted. He then traveled back to San Francisco with his family to build the new bank. He found a lot on Jackson Street facing Montgomery. It cost $32,000. He then contracted a 3-story brick building for $50,000. It was over budget, but Mr. Lucas was happy with the extra cost. The bank was built and Sherman started his civilian life as a businessman. There was a bank failure, and panic ensued. People lined up to withdraw their money from their banks. But luckily, Sherman survived. On July 21, 1857, they opened a branch in New York under the same name, Lucas Turner and Company. In August, the Ohio Life and Trust Company failed, sending people into another panic. In September, things got worse. News also reached New York that the steamer Central America had gone down at sea with what Sherman said was $1,600,000, which I assume is $1,600,000. It went down with 600 passengers as well. Things got worse, and there was a general suspension of the banks in New York, and the crisis spread across the country. Sherman thought that their bank would be okay, but this was not the case, and on October 7th, his bank failed. Sherman was tasked with paying back all their debts, and said no man lost a cent by either of the banking firms, the Lucas and Turner Company of New York or San Francisco, but those who owed us were not always as just. There was around $200,000 in San Francisco in real estate and notes, so Sherman was tasked with finalizing the settlement at Mr. Lucas's request. He did this and then returned home July 28, 1858. He had his wife and 4 children at this point, and he needed to decide what he was going to do with his life. He decided to join his brother-in-laws in Leavenworth, Kansas. They ran a law firm there. He even got a license from a judge to practice law without even taking an exam. He was admitted on the ground of general intelligence. On June 11, 1859, he wrote to the Assistant Adjutant General of the War Department, asking about any vacancies among the Army paymasters. He was told to apply at a military college that was about to be organized in Louisiana. Sherman was told to apply for the superintendent's position. In July 1859, he returned to Lancaster and received a letter saying that he had been elected superintendent of the proposed college and to come to Louisiana as soon as possible. The Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy opened January 1, 1860, with 60 cadets present. Sherman was a Northerner, and his brother John was known as the abolitionist candidate for the Speaker of the House. Many believed he was not the man for the job as superintendent at a Southern military academy. In 1860, secession talks were widespread across the South, and Sherman was known to have sympathy for white Southerners, and was not entirely opposed to the institution of slavery, but he was completely against secession of the Southern states and the breaking up of the Union. His opinions were well known. Secession was treason, was war. South Carolina seceded December 20th, 1860. followed by Mississippi. Sherman wrote that he feared European commentators were right, that our Constitution was a mere rope of sand that would break at the first pressure. A convention of delegates would meet in Baton Rouge, Louisiana on the 8th of January, 1861. Before secession was passed, the governor ordered all the forts at the mouth of the Mississippi and the arsenal at Baton Rouge to be seized. Secession passed in Louisiana, January 26, 1861. Before secession passed, Sherman wrote the governor and said that if Louisiana withdraws from the Union, I prefer to maintain my allegiance to the Constitution, as long as a fragment of it survives. He asked to be replaced the moment the state chooses to secede. Sherman was told by Colonel Bragg to transfer to Smith any arms, ammunition, and funds whenever he chose to withdraw from his position at the college. He wrote on February 1st to Colonel Bragg that he would be at the college for 2 more weeks and that all the arms, ammunition, and funds would be safely stored. He later wrote that on February 19th a receipt was written for the arms, ammunition, and funds by Major Smith. Sherman traveled to Washington to meet with his brother John and even met with the new president, Abraham Lincoln. It was believed that Sherman was trying to gain a position in the army, but he was turned down. In a letter a short time later, he wrote just as much. His brother asked him to stay in Washington, but Sherman refused and headed back home to Lancaster to meet with his family. He received a letter to come to St. Louis that the 5th Street Railroad was a sure thing. Sherman got his family together, and March 27th he headed for St. Louis. Sherman was elected president of the 5th Street Railroad. Tensions were high in Missouri. Being a border state, Sherman was offered an administrative position in the War Department. He wrote back that he could not accept. After the bombardment of Fort Sumter, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee seceded from the Union. It was feared that more border states would follow. Sherman was offered a position as Brigadier General in a meeting with Frank Blair, but Sherman declined. Sherman wrote a letter to the Secretary of War stating that he is always prepared to serve his country, that he cannot volunteer his service because he is unwilling to take a mere private's place, and if his services are needed, the records of the War Department will enable you to designate the station which I can render most service. It seemed now that Sherman was ready to rejoin the army, even after turning down numerous high positions in the War Department and a Brigadier General position. That's it for part 1, people. Sherman's early life and the lead up to the Civil War. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in part 2. Peace.